Welcome to the fourth lecture on comparative politics. In this lecture, we're going to look about how we classify countries and why we put them in certain groups and why we subdivide these groups. Now, at the broadest level, we divide countries into democracies and non-democracies. But within non-democracies and also within the group of democracies, not all nations, not all governments are the same. So we divide them by electoral system, by how they structure their government, by their relationship with their publics. So we're going to go over through some of the basic distinctions that we make. So some basic questions. The first one is we're going to look at, how do nations divide power between central and local governments? And this is a difference that exists both in authoritarian governments as well as democratic governments. Whether power is centralized in the national government or power is distributed among the central and also local and regional governments. The second one is we're going to look at the big divide between democracies and non-democracies. And not all non-democracies are the same, neither are all democracies the same. Just because it's a non-democracy, you could have a traditional monarchy, you could have an authoritarian government, or you could have even a totalitarian government, and these are not really the same thing, and we need to parse them a little bit carefully. Secondly, we're going to look at some of the big differences between democracies, and the most fundamental differences between ones that are run through a parliament and those that are presidential. In parliamentary democracies, the executive and the legislative are basically unified or fused together, while in presidential democracies, they're separate branches of government. And secondly, how they transform votes into seats in the legislature. Do they use a majoritarian principle, meaning whoever gets most votes, or whoever gets the majority of votes, versus a proportional representation system, which tries to map, let's say, every percentage in the electorate to every percentage in the legislature. So let's look at some types of groupings before we get into the things. This one shows you kind of just on a dimension and a score of democracy going from 0 to 10. And this isn't because, as I've said before, comparative political scientists are not really interested in definition, but in measurement. And so they're not trying to define the characteristics of democracy or define the characteristics of authoritarian government as so much as maybe put them on a scale from here in 0 to 10, from 10 being the strongest democracies to 0 being the weakest or least democratic governments. And that gets over what kinds of governments there are. As you can see, in Western Europe and North and South America, you have a lot of relatively strong democracies, while in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, you have a lot of authoritarian regimes that score very low. So this is one way we could group out nations. Now, the question is this the most helpful? Well, for some things, yes, you can kind of see there's a regional geographical distribution of types of governments where they tend to cluster democracies together as well as authoritarian governments cluster together. But it might not tell you everything you want to know, particularly about maybe their political culture, maybe about how society affects their governments. And for example, a government like Central African Republic and Saudi Arabia, even though they are scoring very low on their democracy score, are not really the same. Nor, for example, the United States with Papua New Guinea, both relatively strong and lasting democracies, they're actually quite different. So this might not give us enough information. Now, another way to group them is by government type. And this is the way that we're mostly going to do this. And we can think about states and then two columns, one with democracies, one non-democracies. And we can divide non-democracies into sultanistic, which means traditional or personalistic non-democratic governments, authoritarian regimes such as party states and military dictatorships, or the totalitarian regimes that existed in the mid-20th century, such as Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and Communist China. Democracies, and these are most of the countries we'll be looking at, maybe they're not all great democracies, but they all at least carry out elections, and therefore they are at least to be considered partly as democracies. You can divide them into their electoral system, whether they use a proportional principle or whether they use a majoritarian principle. So, for example, most countries in Western Europe at least have some part of their government determined by proportional representation, and therefore they become parliamentary, where the parliamentary seats are allocated by the percentage of votes in the electorate, Or you can have presidential democracies, the United States probably the most prominent example, which are both majoritarian. And you can distinguish between, let's say, the United States and the United Kingdom, mostly by not whether they use majoritarian principles, both of them do, but whether England uses it through a parliament, while we use it through three branches of government and separation of powers. Now, some governments try to combine different elements of this together, such as Mexico and Russia, and we usually call them hybrid, because there's some mix between, they might, let's say, have a president as well as a parliament. They might have a president and a prime minister. They might have one house elected by proportional principles, another house elected by majoritarian principles. And so this is another way to group things by the type of government. But another way to look at it is to, that's often common, is to group them by ideology or culture. And these are two of the more famous ones. One is by Ronald Inglehart and Christian Wetzel of the University of Michigan, and Samuel Huntington, formerly of Harvard University. The one on the left uses public opinion surveys to classify countries. And on the vertical axis, it goes from nations with dominant traditional values to nations that have some more modern values. And then on the horizontal axis, it goes from materialistic, which he calls survival values, where most of the disputes are about rich and poor, who's getting the biggest share of the pie, versus self-expression values, which mean things about identity, i.e. environmental issues, sexual identity issues, or sexual preference issues, and things of that sort. On the right, you see Samuel Huntington's, where he says, well, grouping things by nation states is really not that helpful, at least not after the Cold War. And actually, if we're going to group countries together, we should group them by what he calls their civilization, which means usually a religious background that ties countries together. So, for example, in the Middle East, they don't really think of themselves always as members of individual nations, but they might see them as a part of a larger Islamic region, or the Ummah, and that might be more relevant. And so Samuel Huntington divided things into Western, Latin, Eastern Orthodox, Chinese, Japanese, Islamic, traditional African culture, and this is a different way to maybe group countries. Now, this might tell you a lot about how people view the world, but it doesn't tell you about the structure of government. So the first thing we're going to look at is the difference between unitary and federal systems. Now, the basic thing is about where the power is distributed in the system and along geographical levels of government. In a unitary system, there's basically one government, that's the national government. And therefore, there's really only one place where there's elections. People elect national officials. They don't elect them within regions of their country, such as New York State or Vermont or Connecticut or Texas or California, but everyone votes in one electorate, which is the national electorate. And even though they might be divided into regions, these regions are just, in a sense, administrative units of the national government. So, for example, instead of the governor of Vermont or the governor of New York being elected solely just by the people of New York, they would be appointed by a Department of Interior from Washington, D.C. So instead of being elected officials, it would be appointed officials, and that appointed official would have the responsibility of, in a sense, supervising affairs in this region. In some ways, this is how U.S. district attorneys are, where there's different regions for different U.S. district courts, and the Department of Justice makes appointments or puts people in charge of the various U.S. district deputy attorney generals. They're not really appointed locally. So that's really what a unitary government is. On the other hand, the one you're probably more familiar with is a federal system, which is what the United States is, which means there's power distributed between the national and local, regional, or state level units, which means, for example, they have their own governments and they might have certain powers within areas. Typically, this means that local governments have a large say over domestic policies such as education, healthcare, or social welfare, while they basically leave monetary, economic, and security issues to the national government. And in other systems, they might be more powerful, where the regions have some type of checking power on the power of the national government, and also the national government might have some oversight about affairs in the state units. So you can see that, partly with the federal government is that they kind of very often it's happening because you have pre-existing ethnicities who have maybe different languages, different cultural norms, an independent political tradition, and therefore they want to have some autonomy within a region in the country that has some guaranteed rights or guaranteed representation. While in the case of unitary country systems, basically you have a constitution that covers the whole country. Everyone thinks they're part of the same system. It also can mean like different sets of laws. For example, in the United States, from state to state, we have different speed limits, whether you can buy things like fireworks, gun laws, different curriculums in education, and all those things differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Now, once again, in unitary, as I said before, in the unitary system, the power goes from the center or the national level to the periphery or the local levels. Local officials are agents of the state. They're appointed by the state. They're usually bureaucrats. They're not elected by the localities. There might not be any local autonomy, which means they don't get to choose or differentiate their policy. And as I said before, there's a division usually between foreign and domestic policy between the state and the national unit. Why? A lot of it has to do with low diversity, which means that people all are part of the same country, they share the same culture, they're one nation, and therefore there's no reason to have separate governments. In some senses, local people might be able to consult with administrative officials in their area, but they don't have, in a sense, control over them. They can't make their own laws. And usually this happens because the state existed before the nation. So, for example, there was a government, or at least if it wasn't the government that exists now, there was a government that pre-existed the nation becoming self-aware. This is the case in France, where there was a king of France before everyone really thought of themselves as being French. And there's other countries where this kind of applies because they had some type of monarchy that pre-existed the state. China would be another example. There's always been a Chinese dynasty, different dynasties at different times in their history, but there's always been a central power, usually located in Beijing. And even though there's a lot of ethnic and linguistic differences throughout China, there's always been that kind of central government, and power always emanated from the center. On the other hand, you have federal governments where power is divided. Local officials, instead of just carrying out the policies of the central state, they're there to represent local interests. So very often they're carrying the preferences or the demands of their constituents and using it to put pressure against the national government, sometimes to tailor their policies or to make sure to direct, let's say, policies to their region. They often have independent tax bases, which means they don't depend upon the federal government for their finances. They have different laws in different jurisdictions, which means their courts might be different. And as I said before, divided responsibilities, and this is different in different countries. This usually happens because there's high diversity in the country. There might be linguistic differences, there might be ethnic differences, there might be religious differences, and therefore they want to have some control, even if there's no really difference in policy preference, in idea what policies they might want, the idea that they have control. So in Europe, for example, there are small regions within larger states, such as Sicily, the Tyrol, the Val d'Aosta in Italy. You have Catalonia in Spain, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland in England, which all have some, say, autonomy or some local government which allows them to have control over their policies. For example, in the United Kingdom, Scotland university education is essentially free to everyone, while in England there is a fee for it. And that's a difference between, let's say, the educational systems of Scotland and England, even though they're still both part of the United Kingdom or Great Britain. Now, often what this means is the state developed after the nation, which means there are many different ethnic identities that have pre-existed, and they were thrown together under the same political organization. This often happens in some post-colonial areas of Africa, and therefore the point is that you have to recognize these different ethnic groups. Or India would be another great example of something that might have federal or a consociational framework. In the United States, people differentiated because the difference between the different colonies at the time of the American Revolution was thought to be important enough. Mostly because until the Civil War, most Americans thought of themselves as members of individual states, not as Americans in the broader sense. Now, let's look at the countries in our course. Now, here is the country. We're going to look at Nigeria, Iran, China, Russia, United Kingdom. So where do they fall on these things? And on the horizontal axis, you have a difference between authoritarian governments and different types of democratic governments. And then, let's say, the geographic distribution of authority from unitary at the bottom to federal to confederal. And so this is where our countries that we'll look at fall on the distribution. So, for example, China and Iran and Great Britain are unitary, at least on paper, if not always indeed. China, the regions matter quite a bit, and many people think that Britain is going from a unitary government to a more federal arrangement over the last decade or so. Federal systems include Nigeria. Russia is a federal system, mostly because of the ethnic diversity in there, and Mexico is also a federal system. Now, they don't always stay in the place. You can see that Nigeria is represented several different places, the Soviet Union and Russia. There's a switch, and most of this means that even though they change their system of government, meaning going from authoritarian to democratic or democratic to authoritarian, they've maintained the same geographical structure to their country. So, for example, Soviet Union went from being an authoritarian government to becoming kind of a mixed presidential parliamentary government after the end of communism, as shown by the red arrow. In the case of Nigeria, it started off as a democratic government, then there was a coup d'etat replaced by a military government, which made it more authoritarian. And even after that, they didn't go back to a parliamentary system. They adopted a presidential system in the Second Republic. Now, the last one where you've had some drift is that Britain went from becoming a unitary actor, where all power was in the one British Parliament, and all had fealty to the British monarch. What you've seen, at least in the last 20, 30 years, is more devolution, which means more autonomy for Scotland, for Wales and Northern Ireland, and therefore having separate parliaments. And so going from a unitary system, at least on paper, to becoming more of a federal system in fact. Now, the system of taking power from the central government and giving it to local governments is called devolution. And it's the opposite of evolution in the sense that centralization is evolved. Devolution means power goes downward. And so why have governments do this? And, in white you have kind of the argument for, in gray the argument against. So people say that localities are closer to the people because it's a small type of government. It's, in a sense, on a walking scale as opposed to a national scale. You get to know your neighbors, and therefore it's somehow maybe perhaps more democratic. However, on the other side, most people know a lot more about national policy issues and national politicians than their local politicians. Most people have a better time naming their U.S. senators and the President of the United States, and are not able to name all 5 members of their school board or their town supervisor or things of that sort. And this means they're less traceable, which means that even though they're closer, quote unquote, because of the scale of government to local governments, they might not have any idea because people do not read local press. They don't really follow the policies until something becomes scandalous, and then, of course, everyone learns everything after the fact, while they have much more of a sense about what's going on at the national level. Some people say that localities are more democratic. The counter-argument to that is the Jim Crow laws in the United States, where states' rights was often a code word for racial discrimination, allowing localities to be anti-democratic by any measure. Some people say localities, there's regional policy preferences. People want different policies in different places. In the same way they might have different cuisines in different regions of a country. That being said, though, if you really look at most localities, they're like 95% the same. And it's mostly because there's a policy consensus at the local level. At the local level, everyone wants better schools, everyone wants to promote economic development, and most people want to reduce crime. And those are really the policies made at the local level, and there's really not much difference despite the fact that we have school boards and police commissions and local mayors. If you're the mayor of New York, you're mayor of Chicago, you're going to do the same thing. The differences are about execution, not about policy. And there's a famous saying about this, that there's no democratic or Republican way to sweep the street. You just want the street swept well. You don't really care about it being swept in a democratic way or a Republican way. Some people make more of an argument that by distributing power, you'll prevent tyranny, which means, for example, that you'll have state governments will be a counterbalance to the power of the central government. However, there have been more than a few federal tyrannies, such as the Soviet Union, which was a federal government, and certainly one of the more totalitarian governments in human history. While the Nazis did centralize power after they seized power, Germany was quite decentralized, at least in the Weimar Republic, leading into, and there was a lot of, for example, many people know about the Gestapo, which is the state police or the national police. Prior to the establishment of the Gestapo, though, that most of the regions like Bavaria and Baden and throughout Germany actually had their local police forces independent. It was only after the fact that they became centralized. So that argument doesn't seem to hold water either. The last one is that if you create many different governments, they'll have differentiated policies. There'll be competition amongst governments. People want to live where there are better policies, and so they'll move from one state to another or from one town to another to take advantage of the better policies. You see this very often where people have opinions about the quality of different school districts, and people will move to school districts that they perceive to have better schools, presumably because they have better policies. And this is the idea of a race to the top, which has been kind of appropriated to talk about this competition going on between states and the American educational system. But often what happens is you have a race to the bottom, such as, for example, different local governments competing to cut taxes to draw businesses. And that wouldn't happen if everyone had to pay the same tax regardless of where someone was located in the country. And so what this happens is that you have, let's say, big giveaways to business, you deplete your tax base, and this doesn't really make anyone better off. The other one is that you have what are called beggar thy neighbor dynamics, which means that people do well by kind of, in a sense, free riding on the services provided by their neighbors. You often see this with suburbs and city centers, where the city generates a lot of the economic activity, but people live in the suburbs and they commute to the city and then leave, but they pay tax in the suburbs, but they don't pay taxes in the city. And so there's that going on as well. So let's look at democracies versus non-democracies. Comparatives generally don't define democracy. As I said, they don't go into like, what is a democracy, and try to create a verbal definition of it. They try to measure it. And probably the most famous example of this is a political scientist named Robert Dahl, who said democracy can be broken down to two different dimensions. The first one is inclusiveness. The second one is what he called contestation. So, for example, the more people who are included in the political system, the more democratic it is. Contestation means if there's more competition in the system, ergo it's more democratic. And if you see on the right, you can see that there's these two dimensions, and the best democracies would be in the upper right-hand corner, which Dahl called polyarchies, which are highly inclusive and also highly competitive. And the most authoritarian would be in the lower left-hand corner, which would be, let's say, authoritarian systems that don't really have any support in the more general public. And then you have in between, let's say, systems such as small oligarchies, which means low suffrage for most people, but the oligarchy is very competitive. So there are factions within the ruling group and they compete with each other. Or you can think of, let's say, systems, mostly the communist systems, which there's lots of participation, there's 90% turnout for elections, but people only really have one choice. As Henry Ford said, you can have your car any color you want as long as the color is black. So what are some examples of this? So we can think of a competitive oligarchy like Athenian democracy, which was very competitive, except that, as you probably learned in Global, women didn't vote, foreigners didn't vote. It was basically only white property men who had the vote. Another example would be apartheid South Africa, which clearly excluded most of its population, the African population, from having very many political rights. So they were hard liberalized in the sense that there was a competitive system. They had elections. There were different parties, but it wasn't inclusive. And so it kind of was this competitive oligarchy model. On the other hand, as I said, Soviet Union, Communist China, Iran since 1979. There's a lot of inclusion, there's a lot of participation, of course a broad part of the population in the political process. However, there's a limit on how many who you can vote for. Many the candidates get pre-screened before they can actually run for office, and therefore you really don't have your full choice. Now, another example of this, there are many things called one-party democracies where there is democratic government, all the civil rights and political rights seem to be in place, they have free and fair elections, but it seems that one party seems to win almost all the time. And even though all three of these parties have collapsed in the last decade and a half, in Mexico with the PRI, Japan, the LDP or Liberal Democratic Party, and in Sweden, the Social Democratic Party, held power for 50 to 60 years apiece, and basically won every single election over those multiple decades. And what this means is that there's probably not really much effective competition, and without competition, do we feel comfortable in calling these democracies, even though it seems to meet all the formal criteria for democracy? So here's another scatter plot just showing you, if you plotted countries in 1985 on the inclusiveness and contestation, what you would see is a distribution of countries in the lower left, a lot of third world, African, South Asian countries. In the upper right-hand corner, you would have a lot of Western European and developed countries. And then you have, let's say, a lot of countries that are very inclusive, including what were at the time mostly communist countries and one-party systems, which were inclusive but didn't have a lot of competition going on. Here's a distribution of all the data points for all the country years, and you'll probably notice that basically the competitive oligarchy quadrant is missing. So that competitive oligarchies generally are not accepted, even though they might have been in the past. Countries are much more likely to be inclusive, vary in terms of inclusivity, but in the sense that there's very few cases of having a very competitive system that is not very inclusive. This shows you several paths that countries have taken as they've become more democratic. So this basically plots, let's say, how democratic, how inclusive, and how much competition they have in years. In the years starting from the 1950s going up to the 1990s. In the upper two levels, you see Spain and Chile, which went from authoritarian governments and then became much more democratic. They took a very simple path, straight diagonal, from being the most authoritarian, the lower left, to the most democratic in the upper right. And if you went to those countries today, they would appear just as strong democracies as you experience, let's say, in the United States. However, if you look at Poland, a former communist country, it was already very inclusive from the beginning. People did participate in Polish elections, even under communism. What was missing, though, was that they could only choose, your only selection was among appointed officials approved by the Communist Party. So the movement you see is mostly a straight vertical, which means that the inclusivity didn't change. What didn't change is that there was more contestation after the fall of communism, or really before that in the 1980s when solidarity was first recognized. On the other hand, you have countries like Egypt, which what happened is that really you've never improved the contestation. It's been relatively a one-party state. But what happened is there's been increasing inclusiveness over time, which means groups that have been excluded before have been given the franchise in the political system. That being said, you still have more or less a one-man military-backed government centered in Cairo. So let's look at non-democracies, and we generally differentiate non-democracies by three dimensions, whether they mobilize or demobilize the public, whether they legitimate themselves by traditional or charismatic authority, and whether they rule through a political party, such as the Communist Party or a Nazi Party, or they rely upon, let's say, control of the bureaucracy, often the military. So, and you can see this in this cube space here, which is based upon Linz's criteria, where you see totalitarianism, which is kind of the system of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and Communist China. And in the lower up front, lower right corner, you have sultanism, which is more of a traditional monarchy or modern day version monarchy, which is not particularly which is mostly about demobilizing the public. So totalitarian governments, they mobilize the public. If you can think about, those films of the Nuremberg rallies where, Hitler is leading and people are marching and cheering, the public is involved, or the public at least is giving their voice in support of the system. Once again, they have charismatic leaders, Hitler being kind of probably the best example, but you can think of something like Perón in Argentina, or even, let's say, Lenin in Russia or Mao in China. The charismatic leader is the focus, and usually there's a cult of personality around the leader figure. And they use a political party, which means that even though there aren't necessarily elections in these totalitarian regimes, they do have a party which, in some sense, represents the people or claims to speak for the people's interest. And this gives it some form of legitimacy. It's not naked open coercion. Usually it's getting people to join in activities, whether they be youth groups, whether they be consulting on non-essential policies that don't figure upon the power of the totalitarian regime, etc. The last thing is that totalitarian regimes don't just want to control the political system, they want to use their political power to control the social and economic system as well. And the word what we use totalitarian is because they're trying to control all aspects of life. On the other hand, you have sultanistic regimes where the public is very demobilized, which means essentially the government doesn't want or need the support of the people. They just want them to be apathetic, which means they don't want them to challenge the system, but they don't need them actively involved in maintaining their rule. And very often they have traditional criteria and power. So, for example, they might be just based upon a religious background, or let's say, in some parts of the world, a hereditary rule. And they rely upon, let's say, control of the military and bureaucracy of the central government to stay in power. But basically it's nondescript, and it's kind of, let's say, lazy or complacent authoritarianism. But on the other hand, they will allow freedom in non-political areas, which means you have many military governments that allowed for economic freedom, such as in East Asia. And you also, for example, they can be relatively progressive on social criteria, which means they might provide what we consider relatively progressive social rights, and not necessarily persecute people who might be different. All they want is people not to challenge their political power. So some of the examples of authoritarian types can be military juntas, theocracies, warlords, or what Kilpatrick called tin pot despots. So let's look at some of the types of democracy. And here we're going to look at the first divide, which is between majoritarian democracies and democracies based on proportional representation. So what does it mean to be majoritarian? It means essentially that the first principle, the core principle of the democracy, is majority rules. So in the way that they convert votes into seats, basically it follows a principle of a plurality, majority, which means whoever gets 50 plus 1% gets 100% of the seat. So you have single seats like we have in the United States. There are two contestants. These contestants have an election. Whoever gets the most votes, or whoever gets the majority of the votes, gets 100% of the power, gets the whole seat. Plurality as opposed to majority means you might have more than one candidate running in the seat, and therefore whoever gets the largest share of votes. So for example, if it's a three-way election, someone can win with, let's say, 30 or 40%. They don't need to get 50% of the votes, but the point is they still get 100% of the seat. So what very often when you see along with this is that there's one member per geographic district. In some places these are just drawn representing geographical areas. In other cases there's an effort to make them equal as far as the number of people living in each district. One thing about there's something about majoritarian is that they have something called Duverger's law. Duverger's law is not a law, it's kind of like a empirical regularity, which means whenever you have majoritarian voting procedures, you tend to get a two-party system. And essentially this is because the third party is not effective because it can't win, it always is not competitive, it's always going to be third, and therefore the people who support the third party would be better off supporting either the first or the second option, whichever one is closest to their policy positions. In other ones, you have proportional representation, which means the percentage of the vote translates into a percentage of the seats. So what often has, they have a large region or a national electorate, and if you can get 5% of the vote, which would mean you would get 0% of the seats in the majoritarian system. In a proportional system, 5% of the vote means you get 5% of the seats. And this allows people to vote for smaller parties or ones that are closer to their specific preferences. It allows for different relatively minor issues, and not minor in the sense of importance, but minor in the sense of getting total votes, such as environmental issues, workers' issues, religious issues, regional issues, linguistic issues, can have a party. And then what happens is there's really no wasted votes because you don't have to vote strategically. You can vote for you can vote for the person who you like best or who's closest to your preferences. Generally, what this means also is that you vote for a party. You don't vote for an individual candidate. The party creates a list of candidates. If they go from the top of their list to the bottom of the list. And so if they get 20% of the vote, they count down their list, whatever is 20%, and those people represent in government. And so they don't have to be from geographical areas. They just have to share a policy preference. You can sometimes have multi-member districts, which means more than one person chosen from an electorate. What also happens is that you can have fragmented parties. And what fragmented parties is that you can have multi-parties, 5 parties, 6 parties, 7 parties, all representing different points of view. But once they're elected, they can form coalitions and then form a government. And so it's a very different type of system. So what types of democracies and what types of electoral systems? So on the left, you can see a map of the world. As you can see that plurality or majoritarian systems basically are in English-speaking areas of the world, England, the United States, and through the countries that formerly were part of the British Empire, such as India, East Africa, Egypt, etc., have these majoritarian systems. What you see in the rest of the world, countries, European countries, Latin America, have adopted more proportional systems. And part of this is because of the political traditions. People adopted the political system of their mother country in some cases, or whatever they had the closest ties to. On the right-hand side, you just see the distribution of systems and where some of the countries that we will be studying fall into what types of electoral systems. So, for example, majoritarian systems include Australia, which has an alternative vote, which means that you can vote for one person, and then if your person is elected, you have a second vote. So then essentially there's 2 rounds. And you have a 2-round system, which means many people might run in the first round, and then it's the number of people. The weaker candidates are eliminated, and then there's another round of elections. This happens in France, but also can happen in Iran. In other types of majority systems, the more common are what are called plurality systems, or first past the post. This means whoever gets the most votes gets the seat. You can have 1 person per district. This is what happens in the United States. It's what happens in Nigeria. It's also what happens in the United Kingdom. Most of the other countries will have some type of proportional representation. Mexico has a mixed system where they have a combination of majoritarian procedures for some seats and proportional for others, and so we'll put them kind of in a combined case. In Ireland, they have what's called the single transferable vote, which means you get 1 vote, but you can then vote for another person, if that, in the sense that you can transfer your vote, i.e., if it doesn't get elected, it goes to the next, second preference, third preference, etc. In most of Western Europe and also in Russia, you have proportional representation, which means parties make lists of their candidates, and you vote for the party, and depending on what percentage of the vote the party gets, they get a certain share of the total of the seats in the legislature. So let me tell you how this would change the system. So let's look at the 2008 election in New York State. Now, there weren't any senators running, but President Obama was running, and he got 63% of the state vote. And you might think of that as what the Democratic vote for the state would be if, let's say, for example, the Democrats were voting just in one common electorate rather than voting in different congressional districts. So even though you could say the Democrats only had 63% of the vote, they did win 90% of the House seats in New York State in 2008, or 26 out of 29 seats. Now, 63 becomes 90. Basically, what you see is it amplifying the power of majorities. And so what majoritarian systems do is tend to make it more governable by giving the majority party more seats in the legislature, giving them a large margin of error to get, let's say, policies passed. And also, if you look at the 2008 election from a national level, the Democrats got 53% of the votes in House seats, which means if you looked at all the House seats combined, 53% of the votes were cast for Democratic candidates. However, in the same election, they didn't get 53% of the seats, they got 59% of the seats. So majoritarian formulas basically increase the number of seats to the majority. And there's reasons to do this. However, people don't think it's quite really representative. And if you look at the maps below, you can see the distribution. On the left-hand side, you can see the blue congressional districts that went Democratic and the red congressional districts that went Republican. And you would think that New York State is almost completely Democratic. However, if you look at the county-by-county breakdown and where Obama got greater or lesser support, what you can see is that many counties were actually voted majority Republican, including many counties in western New York and a lot of counties on the southwest side of the Adirondacks. And also in the New York City area, Putnam County and Staten Island went majority Republican, although the people who represent them, the districts they were in, they basically elected Democratic House representatives. Now, the second type of divide is between parliamentary systems and presidential systems. In parliamentary systems, legislative and executive branches are fused, which means that you don't vote for the executive, you only vote for your legislative seat, whether you vote in a national electorate or in a local district, and then the legislature selects, the majority of the legislature selects the executive, or the prime minister in this case. Now, what this means is that there's no check on the majority. The majority basically has all the power. There's no, let's say, veto, because in essence, the prime minister is the representative of the majority of the people in the legislature. And he only has power as long as he has the majority behind him. What they do often happen when they have parliamentary is they do separate the head of government, which is the prime minister, from the head of state. In some countries that have historical monarchies, like in England, the Queen is the head of the state, so they carry out, it is the symbolic and also the ceremonial figurehead for the state. In other countries, they have an elected president who's relatively weak, who acts as the head of state, while the prime minister is the head of government and is really in charge of, let's say, controlling and passing legislation. In presidential systems, legislative and executive roles are separate. And this is because of the belief in checks and balances. The idea that the executive has a separate mandate from the people and is able to check, let's say, the local, particularly when they're just local geographical areas, the local preference is the local mandate of individual representatives in the legislature. But very often there's a problem because the executive roles are merged. The head of government is also the head of state, and very often he's also the head of a particular political party. So they have to be divided between representing all the people and also representing the preferences of the people who have voted for that executive, whether they're in the United States or Democrat or Republican or conservative or Labor in England. The last thing about presidential is they tend to have fixed terms in office. Now, a prime minister, if they lose the confidence of the majority of the legislators, they can take down the prime minister at any time. They don't have to impeach them. They just have a vote of no confidence. On the other hand, though, presidents have a term of office, whether it's 4 years or 6 years or longer, which means that they can't be taken out of office except for extraordinary means like impeachment. If, for example, people start to disagree with their decisions or policy or competence. And if you look at, for example, the end of the Bush administration in the United States, by 2006, even many Republicans wanted to get rid of George Bush, but he still had 2 more years in office. And so you have a system where the political system can be in drift without an ability to change course. And this might have affected, for example, the response to the 2008 financial crisis, where President Bush really played a secondary role and didn't really have his hand on the rudder in many cases, and partially because even his own party wasn't supporting him. So when they tried to pass things like TARP, he couldn't even get enough votes from his own party to support the president's initiatives. So what's happened over time with presidential and parliamentary systems? Well, basically, pure presidential and pure parliamentary systems have basically gone horizontal. There's been some movement up and down, but basically no major increases. What you've seen is an increase in mixed republics, which means systems that have a symbolic president and also have a parliamentary system. Particularly, let's say, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, etc. These growth, and you can see this is in the late 80s with the end of communism, you saw the growth of these mixed systems. But in generally, pure presidential systems people have been questioning them because they're seen as being unstable or having other types of flaws with them, so they haven't been the most popular around the world. And when the United States has gone and tried to impose democracy in different parts of the world, they haven't, let's say, installed the American version of democracy. They're much more likely to install some parliamentary version. So one of the things in political science is that people really think that presidential democracies have a lot of problems. Outside the United States, they've been very unstable. They've led to the breakdown of democracies. They've led to really poor dynamics. And let me just make the case, usually associated with the political scientist named Juan Linz, about why there's a peril to presidential democracies. The first one is that it creates a winner-take-all or a zero-sum dynamic because, for example, you can have a case like in the election of 2000 in the United States where essentially you get a 50-50 tie, but 50 plus 1% got the entire presidency. And this can lead to a very divided where people really become oppositional and adverse. The elections become very high stakes. People get really worked up over the election. And as a result, they might not accept an election that goes against them because they feel, well, 50% of the people are unhappy with the result of the election. And this can lead to more conflict and instability. And you kind of see this on the top chart, which shows you that the more presidential the system or the less parliamentary the system, what happens is you see very high negative correlations with independent measures of democracy, whether they're the Freedom House scores or whether it's the Polity 4 scores. Presidential or one party or unified executives are highly associated with kind of, let's say, a lower quality of democracy. The second thing that they do is they tend to enhance candidate-centered politics. People vote for presidents based on whether they like the president or their personal character, and therefore take their policies second, which means candidates become more important and parties become less important, meaning that personality becomes more important than policies. And for a variety of reasons, this can lead to bad government. The third is that presidents have fixed terms in office, and which can lead to gridlock and divided government, and this can make government basically incompetent or ineffective, particularly in response to certain types of crisis, because the president can want one thing and the legislature can want another thing. Fourth, you split legitimacy between the executive and legislature. Both can claim to represent the people, the legislature because they're directly elected, the president also because elected by the national. And you can find many examples where both sides are claiming to speak for the people, and it's not clear who has a better claim to that mandate. And finally, the rate of democratic breakdown is particularly high in presidential democracies. And you can see this on the chart on the bottom right about the number of crises by political system. And you can see presidential republics, which are presidential democracies, have one of the highest rates of crises and breakdown, a lot more, like twice the level of, let's say, a parliamentary system. So this kind of basically sums up the different types of systems and some of the advantages and disadvantages. You should know basically why these systems are the way they are, but also like how they're differentiated and why they're differentiated. Thank you.